Hello.
Hi. Hi, Michelle. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm great.
So, should we introduce ourselves?
Oh, no. You should go first.
Okay. Well, I'm Michelle Goldberg. I'm the author of The Means of Reproduction, Sex, Power, and the Future of the World, which came out in paperback last week. And I'm also a columnist for the Daily Beast and a senior correspondent for the American Prospect.
And I'm Anthea Butler. I'm Associate Professor of Religion at the University of Pennsylvania. And I have a book back from 2007 called Women in the Church of God in Christ, Making a Sanctified World. And I write for Religion Dispatches and talk about Pentecostalism, evangelicals, Catholics, all sorts of people. So thank you, Michelle, for agreeing to be with me today. This is going to be great.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. And I guess we agreed that we were going to start out by talking about the scandal in the Catholic Church, which there's something about it that I still really don't understand, because even if you accept that the Vatican's aim was simply to kind of cover up the scandals and preserve the authority of the Church, that still, from where I sit, doesn't explain their actions. I mean, if you really were concerned about the whole and the community over the individual, and you simply wanted to kind of preserve the illusion of infallibility, wouldn't the obvious move then, just from a kind of Machiavellian point of view, would be to hide these priests away rather than transfer them to? I mean, it seems like what they're doing was almost consciously inviting scandals. So there's something going on that I just don't understand.
Yeah, well, I think it's hard for people who don't understand what a clustered up, crazy hierarchy this is. I mean, if you think about, I keep using the Toyota comparison. If you think about how long it took for Toyota to get this done, think about how hard it must be for the Vatican, who's sort of still living in some ways in the 19th century, to try to get a handle on this. And so the excuses we've heard in the last few weeks, let's say, and the things that have happened, I think point to a totally unwieldy hierarchical structure that you can't figure out where how bad this is, because you don't really quite want to look at it as badly as it is. That's one. The second thing is, and I think this is also hard for people who don't watch these things carefully, and that's a lot of us, okay? I'm trained as a historian, but let me tell you, it's a mess for me to figure out too, is to think about how diffuse this is. Because not only do you have, you've got the Vatican as a structure and a pseudo-state, a state really, but it's a made-up state, right? And then you've got dioceses that have the power over their parishioners and the priests that work for them. Then you've got all these religious orders where you've had problems because they have educational institutions. I mean, you can see where the right hand really doesn't even know what the left hand is doing, and they're not even sure that there's a left hand, okay?
But this is the thing. The thing that doesn't make sense, though, is that when there is, say, some deviation from orthodoxy, when there's some priest in Latin America who's, kind of promulgating the social gospel, or when there's, a kind of professor at a Catholic university questioning some aspect of Catholic teachings, or when there's a nun who gets out of line, the whole hierarchy seems to work pretty well in kind of quashing those. I mean, this hierarchy clearly has the power to kind of swoop in and correct dissidents and deviants.
Yeah, but think about that. That's a small number of people relative to what we got here in the sex scandal. So think about it this way. This is where I've been trying to explain it to everybody. You can chase after a Sabrino or Roger Haight or Charlie Curran because it's easy to go find out what they've written, what they've done, and everything else. Think about chasing after thousands of priests or nuns or religious that have done all this stuff, and you decide, I'm going to tell you exactly what they did here after 2000 when Benedict started all this. You've got 3,000 cases and you've got 10 people handling it. And you won't let anybody from the outside handle it, not even your own trusted higher lay people. And you can multiply that probably at least by 100. I'm guessing there are so many cases everywhere. And we're not talking about a 10-year span or 20-year span. think 50 to, maybe 75 to 100-year span.
But you just said, you won't let any outside people handle it. But in a sense, what at least some of the kind of apologists for the church are saying is that they did let outsiders handle it. They said that, they were the victims of this kind of therapeutic culture that made them think anything could be, which to me, again, seems ridiculous. Since when has the church kind of let itself be bulldozed by, kind of Enlightenment, modern psychotherapeutic ideas? I mean,
the conservatives will tell you it was the 1970s. It was after Vatican II after all this happened, right? So we have to blame all the psychologists and everything else for what happens. But see, I don't like that argument either because it lets them off the hook. I mean, listen, I'm with you. I understand. They should not have done this at all. This is stupid.
No, I guess to me, what I'm trying to understand, and what it seems to me, they're behaving as if they really, as if this is something that they didn't find shocking, as if it was kind of something that was to be expected, as if it was just a kind of, a little spell of naughtiness on the part of these priests, which makes me think that it's far more, that it's even more entrenched and kind of even more common than we believe. I mean, it kind of reminds me of the South Park episode where they're having this conclave and one of them says something like, well, we just have to stop molesting children, and everybody else responds with kind of shocked outrage to that suggestion.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
It really makes me...
Exactly. Or the Onion where they just said, the Pope's like, we need to reduce this. This is actually getting far too much. But, here's what I'd say. I mean, there probably is a grain of truth to the South Park episode in this way. We've got to figure out how we could get these numbers down. But the truth of the matter is part of it's in the training. Pre-Vatican II, you told people when they went for ordination, you had no particular friendships, okay? You couldn't be friends with anybody when you went into the seminary. You had to keep those things apart. Things happened in the seminary. People who had these experiences may have gone on to molest somebody else, I think it's institutionalized. I'm sorry, I just do. And I think that what has happened is now that they have, they're trying to blame it on homosexuality or whatever, they have to look at what the institution has done. The institution has put this in place. And then you put these guys in a rectory by themselves, let them drink, tell them that you're the representative of Jesus Christ on earth, and shoot, you start thinking you can do whatever you want to do. And if it's been done to you, and if you're not supposed to have normal relationships, and nobody wants to talk about sex except to say no, I mean, no is a powerful aphrodisiac. And I'm not saying this is an aphrodisiac in a good way. It's power. And people don't understand that a lot of times what happened to children is not just about sexual stuff. It's an exercise of power of, a clergy member over somebody who has no power whatsoever. And that to me is the most heinous part of all this, is that I'm sick of the prancing around of trying to figure out, how we're going to protect ourselves when the fact of the matter is that generations of men and women have been subjected to basically institutionalized rape at the hands of a church that tried to tell them what to do with their bodies. Mm-hmm. That's wrong.
Do you think that it's, in terms of kind of why this is so prevalent, I mean, this seems to be prevalent actually in most kind of strictly hierarchical religious organizations. It certainly happens with there's a big story recently out of India about, the latest Swami to get caught up in a sex scandal. Yeah. But in terms of the Catholic Church, do you think it's that, I mean, on the one hand, I think that there's probably no more wretched person on earth than somebody who really has these kind of strong pedophilic urges and is trying to resist them. And I wonder if the church attracts pedophiles because it actually promises them a role in society in which they can hopefully live with some kind of grace, and then maybe they find themselves unable to resist. Or do you think it's that because this has been so endemic in the church, it kind of is creating pedophiles because victims tend to often grow up to become offenders?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of both of those. I also think that, a lot of what seems to be coming out from some of these cases when you start to read them is there's a personality type involved. And that personality type is basically, I didn't do anything wrong. It's not my fault. It's the shifting of blame, which you're seeing everybody from the top down do, which tells you something, right? If you're willing to shift the blame, I'm not at fault. Somebody else attracted me. I couldn't help myself. Blah, 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 blah. If it's always someone else and not you, then there's a problem there. And I also do think that, in some sense, this whole idea about what they thought is, if you call homosexuality disorder, then what the hell do you call, pedophilia? I mean, homosexuality is not a disorder.
Well, and that's what's so bizarre, is that they're actually responding to pedophilia with much less kind of outrage than they respond to homosexuality with.
Exactly. Or abortion or anything else for that matter. And I mean, I always think the wrong turn was they didn't deal with this in Vatican II, which, they should have moved forward. It wasn't just, birth control, it was sexuality, period. And this whole thing has just twerked it so that, the people who don't get relief out of all this are the people who've been molested. Mm-hmm. And that's what the real shame is that, the attention has been placed on the church and the hierarchy. I mean, like, crap, sue them all, throw them in jail, do what you got to do. But the people who've been hurt are the people who are left out in the cold on this, unless they would SNAP or, or Voice of the Faithful or Bishop's Accountability. And they don't get any, they may get monetary satisfaction. And even the folks in Europe are probably going to get monetary satisfaction. But they get at least the fact that this stuff is exposed once and for all. Now, can they get this out of the church? I don't know. I'm going to be honest with you, and I'll tell you it's going to take 50 years, minimum, if they think they can handle this situation. But it will not be the same organization that it is now. They can't get people in vocations. The bigger issue is going to be they can't get insured. Nobody's going to insure anybody in the diocese anymore, whether you're the straightest person or the most celibate person or anything. Who's going to insure?
Is that really But I mean, are they having that issue? Are they having?
Yeah, they are having that issue. I mean, you have to start looking at. I mean, what will tell you how this is happening is this. You've got in the United States, you've got the guy that's in Minnesota right now, Alexander, who's has a couple of cases where he's gotten from the Circuit Court of Appeals the right to sue the Vatican. Okay, so that's number one. The second is look at all these school closings in all the dioceses, mm-hmm. all the closing of the Catholic Church, the Catholic educational system. Why? They don't have the people anymore to fill those schools, and they don't have the money, and they can't keep up the physical property. So if you follow the money on this thing, the fact of the matter is, and then you start looking at these big dioceses who paid out a lot of money. Everybody paid attention to Boston. The dioceses you should have paid attention to was Los Angeles that had a $660 million payout. But trust me, that's going to be like $1.5 million by the time they pay the lawyers and everybody else. So the money is the real instance here, because they can't go on this way. And when you don't have people putting money in the coffers because they're disgusted with the church and the leadership, you have nowhere to go. This church in 50 years will be a church that is populated by people who don't have a lot of money, who may be willing to follow the Pope et al., but they won't be able to put in the same kind of money that the Americans and the Europeans did.
So what do you think that means for the church's political influence? I mean, we just got through this, instance in which we basically had the Catholic bishops taking a legislative role in crafting or in trying to thwart healthcare reform, which is especially galling to have them making decisions that are actually going to affect me, given that they, given their kind of flagrant sexual immorality.
Yeah. I think, I tell you, see, this time around, what you have to notice is, who do they have to pair up with? Family Research Council, okay? They don't have the clout or the moral authority anymore to do it on their own. So they're going to have to pair up with other conservative religious organizations. And before, 10 years past, they would be able to lead something like this. They can't even lead it anymore. And then they end up being on the wrong side of everything, even, against what basic Catholic teaching is. So I think what you see is overall is a real sense in which the power and the moral and, sort of authority that they might have, however you want to construe that, in a governmental sense, they've lost it, and I think this is a downhill spiral for them. I really do. I mean,
so do you think we'll start seeing them less able to kind of intervene in international affairs? I mean, they've been very effective in pushing for abortion bans all around the world. They've been pretty effective at kind of, if not thwarting, at least stymieing, UN efforts to expand kind of women's rights and human rights law.
Yeah, well, I think, once you start once the UN and everybody else, or as I said in the article, I mean, UNICEF should get them just basically on child abuse. Once you start realizing that, the vast malfeasance of the church in this regard in terms of the pedophilia scandal, I think they'll find that they won't have the same kind of clout. I mean, already people are asking in England for them not to come. It's going to cost, the UK millions to bring him, Pope Benedict, there. And I think there's a rising sense among the population that they don't want to pay for this. They don't want to pay for this guy who's not, morally upstanding, let's say, or with all the revelations that are happening. Why should we have a leader like this? Does he look any different than, a Charles Taylor or someone else who had child soldiers and abused children? I mean, you have to start asking those questions. So I think the clout is lost, and I think especially, which is probably killing them right now, but I think this is really the case, you notice that the death of John Paul II just kind of went underneath the radar screen this past week because of everything happened. I think it blows his chances for canonization.
Well, worse than that, I mean, it seems like some of them are even trying to blame him.
Exactly. Let's just blame the dead. Well, that's because that's what they used to do. That's what they're used to do.
To kind of deflect, attention from Ratzinger, which is astonishing.
Which is really bad. But I'm telling you, I think that, there's much more to come. And I think that they did not heed the lesson of the American bishops. I mean, it took the American bishops, as Tom Rees said in an America article, about 17 years to get this right and figure it out what they needed to do. But they always go into retrench mode and, what are we gonna say to push back the media? And I don't think you can call this gossip at all. If this is gossip, then it's got a lot of legs. It's really strong, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon.
Speaking of things that aren't going away, we were emailing about the Hutaree. Is that how you pronounce it? Hutaree?
Hutaree. I mean, it sounds like some kind of. It sounds like Hutaree, that old show back in the '60s, where they were out on safari. That's the way I remember it.
I've been out of the country, so I've been reading about it, but I haven't heard about it. I mean, or you know what I mean? I haven't been watching television. Although I did see. Yeah. I did see.
What did you see? How was the coverage outside the country? I'm curious about this because I'm always wondering how this kind of right wing stuff reads to everybody.
I don't even know that I did see it covered. Where I was. It was. I'm sure it was on. I was watching BBC World. I'm sure they covered it at one point, but I didn't. If they did, I didn't see it, and it certainly wasn't. In the kind of constant headlines. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, essentially, this whole thing about Christian militias. This is not a new idea.
Of course.
What's different about this, and is that it's sort of a small, homegrown kind of family-run thing. First of all, and second, which really is actually the backstory that I want to know, is how much is the FBI tracking groups like this because it's been Obama in the White House. I mean, obviously the Southern Poverty Law Center says, there's been this great rise in all these things. But to watch the video that they had when they were online of them sort of like out doing these sort of paramilitary moves out in the desert, everybody forgets this is Michigan, right? So what's the other big thing that was in Michigan? Well, this was where, Blackwater originates, right? And so you've got this sense in Michigan, period. And I'm not saying this is to make all Michiganders bad, but there's a real sense there already with some of these rightist Christian groups that it's okay to arm up to protect yourself.
Right. Well, and it's also the home of the famous Michigan militia, even though evidently they
exactly. And I would put these people. Unfortunately, they hadn't gotten there yet. But I put them in the same category as, we're gearing up to a Timothy McVeigh kind of event. If they're going to say, we want to kill a couple policemen, and then at the policeman's funeral, we're going to kill some more people. That's like, that's trying to incite something, right? So it's not just about violence, it's about sedition.
Well, and the other thing that's, it seems to me pretty clear that this is not a one-off, that this is part of a broader phenomenon that's been escalating a lot just in the last year, and that every sign is that it's going to continue to escalate. And one of the things that I thought deserved a lot more attention is that their views are being treated as somehow incredibly marginal, and certainly it's not the majority of Christian conservatives or evangelicals are not going out and forming paramilitary militias. But that's certainly very much part of kind of evangelical ideology. I mean, it was hard not to think about, watching this, I think somebody illustrated a story about this militia with the Left Behind video game.
Exactly.
But that was really telling. I mean, the Left Behind video game, you basically form a Christian militia to fight the forces of the Antichrist, who are basically UN peacekeepers, on the streets of New York City. And so, although what they were doing, basically they were acting out a kind of very, very mainstream fantasy that really runs through, a great deal of the Christian right. Although sometimes people believe that the Antichrist comes out of the United Nations, like he does in the Left Behind books, it's not uncommon at all for evangelicals to identify the Antichrist with the head of the European Union. John Hagee did it, and certainly hasn't resulted in his kind of banishment from polite society.
Yeah, and I do think, I want to take it one step further. I mean, when this is part of your belief system, you got to understand, this, for evangelicals, even before Left Behind, there was A Thief in the Night, and there were all these...
Right, and The Late Great Planet Earth.
Yeah. So, this whole theology, this whole belief system has been there for a while. And so it's a natural leap. I mean, how many, this recent poll, I forget the number, like all these people thought Obama's the Antichrist, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, this is a new one. There's never been a black Antichrist before. Okay. So that's absolutely saying something about the level of, fear and craziness that's kind of rampant in these sorts of communities. But I think, this is a conversation I've been trying to have with people, is that you have to realize that sometimes for, in the case of certain kind of apocalyptic beliefs like this, whatever you can do to help the apocalypse come is a good thing. And I think this is what, sometimes scholars miss, but I don't think anybody in the media misses this, that it's a nice little move to go from believing something to making your belief happen.
Although it's interesting, because from what I've read, this group didn't believe that they, unlike, say, the Left Behind novels, they didn't believe that they were going to be raptured and basically get to miss all the carnage. I mean, they were kind of preparing to arm up for the tribulations, which is a different spin on these beliefs. And it
is different, but it's not that far-fetched, because I think a lot of, especially dominionist theology now, mm-hmm. it's not so much about getting raptured and being taken away. It's about fighting and taking it back. So that's a different kind of thing, and I think so many people have paid attention to this the sort of rapture theology, right? That they don't realize that there's always been 2 or 3 different belief systems about this. There are people who think that there's a rapture. There's people who think, there's no rapture. We're just going to have to fight our way through this. And then there's people who don't think there's this millennial thing at all. Mm-hmm. So it's really different to see these people who are, saying we're going to fight our way through it. We're going to prepare for this because we know it's going to be bad, right? And I think those are even more fearful. Those are the people to be feared more than the ones who think they're just going to be raptured. Because, if you just get raptured, you don't have to deal with any of this stuff.
Can I ask you, what do you make? Did you see the video that Talking Points Memo found of it was this kind of strange home movie that one of the members of the militia made? And I think that they described it on Talking Points Memo as something like Birth of a Nation meets Jackass. I mean, it was the weirdest. It was one of the weirdest things I've ever watched on the internet.
I haven't seen it, but describe it, because I'm interested. Now I have to go back and look at it.
Well, it basically featured one of the members naked, I believe wearing a mask of George Bush over his penis. And he was fighting with this duck-headed monster. And okay. I honestly don't know if this duck-headed monster if it has any symbolism. It was lost on me, although
I'm still stuck on George Bush on top of somebody's the George Bush mask on his penis. I can't get past that. I can't even see the duck yet. God. Yeah. I mean, what was that supposed to mean? Was there a narrative on the side of it? Did he play music? What?
Yeah, they played music. I think they played music. It was some kind of I mean, it was really strange. It's really worth watching, and if you could, decode it, I would be incredibly curious to hear.
I'm not sure that there's any decoding of that, but I will watch it. Right? Maybe. Oh, this sounds like some really sick stuff, man. I mean, I'm all for do what you want to do in the privacy of your home, but when these things start to get out on the internet, and you're wearing a George Bush mask over your penis, that's like some really bad porn. That's just not even entertaining.
But it did kind of create like a whole new dimension to me to their.
Well, clearly, and I mean, I guess I would wonder: is George Bush the symbol of power? Is he the cause of all these problems? I wonder if anybody's bothered to show this to George. That's what I would really like to know.
I think perhaps it was made. I think perhaps it was made during the Bush administration. Although I'm not quite sure.
Oh God! I will say this about this group. I mean, what will be interesting is they bring them to trial. What kind of people will that attract? And are they going to be looked at by other groups as being martyrs? Because I think that's that's something that I wonder. Will that happen? Or will other groups just think of them as being aberrant and not the same as the kind of things that they want to push forward?
So far the militia movement has been trying hard to distance itself from them.
Yeah.
Which is kind of very different than the attitude it took towards like Randy Weaver or David Koresh. I mean, perhaps because they haven't been injured, but...
Yeah. Yeah, but this just sounds... I mean, it may be a one-off, but I don't think it's a one-off in the sense of a lot of these groups still have, some core of that belief system. And so what it means is that I think... As things go forward, and depending on what the economic situation looks like, depending on what our situation vis-a-vis continued military involvement in the Middle East looks like, I don't think these groups are going away. But right. I do think they will shift and change according to what they perceive as the threat. And right now, I think a lot of these groups think that their own government is the threat, and that's the number one thing. What would be interesting to me is if that shifts if we get another president in 2012, or it intensifies because we get the same president.
I think we're likely. I think Obama's really likely to be reelected. In part because of this movement. I mean, that might be me being far too optimistic, but given the fact that right now you kind of can't become a Republican candidate without passing this kind of Tea Party litmus test. I mean, I guess Massachusetts is possibly an example in that they backed, kind of Scott Brown, who was a little bit more socially moderate. But it's hard for me to imagine at this point the Republican Party nominating anybody electable.
Yeah. Well, maybe.
Perhaps. Maybe I should, knock on wood. But what's that?
Maybe. I think in the local candidates or state candidacies, it might be people who are electable. But
certainly. They'll. Certainly. Mark Rubio might, could easily win in Florida. All these things. I just mean in terms of a presidential candidate that could take on Obama, especially if the economy turns around. At a time when a party that doesn't even have room for David Frum.
That was definitely like, we're going to ride you out of town, huh?
Yeah, I mean it's. So the party's becoming kind of ever more pure, and it's this self-fulfilling prophecy that it's this kind of self-fulfilling cycle that as it becomes more pure, it sheds more, it sheds its moderates, it kind of drives out the unbelievers, and which creates an ever more kind of ideologically homogenous and kind of inward-looking kind of movement. And the thing is that because they've so convinced themselves that they are a majority, that seems to be that's a staple of Glenn Beck's TV show. That's a staple of the Tea Party movement. Believes that it has, that it put more people on the streets for its protests than came to see Obama being inaugurated. It has this, I was actually on a plane the other day, and I was flying to Finland, actually, or I was flying to Helsinki, and there was this American woman sitting next to a Swedish woman right near me, explaining how, the polls might show that Americans were happy about healthcare reform, but really they're not, and that these polls are hiding something, and the Americans have been rising up against this thing. But this conviction that they really are a secret majority, that they are kind of silent majority, which was true in the Nixon era, but it's not true now, I think means that they have no reason to reach out. They have no reason to kind of open the tent, because they already believe that they have the numbers.
Well, yeah, the tent is already, is circumscribed by, certain kinds of boundaries. And no, they don't have to open up the tent. But what I think is really interesting is kind of, sort of ties all the things that we've been talking about together, is that nobody has to believe anything they don't want to believe anymore. Mm-hmm. So you can make your own truth up. So, I mean, this is truly the postmodern thing, because if she can sit there and explain on the plane that how this doesn't work and everybody's lying and all this, I mean, everything is a conspiracy theory, right?
Right.
I mean, there's you can believe what you want to believe. You don't have to be confronted with any proof. You always have an excuse for it. And, whether it's Tea Party or, the Vatican saying we're not doing this to kids, or, the Hutaree, anybody, you can just make it how you want it to be. And I think that's the part that's so interesting to me, is that how do you create your own little alternative realities when everything else around you says something very different?
Well, and that's been, in certain ways, the religious rights project for decades now.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's where kind of creationism and the Creation Museum and this alternative history that they've been peddling, both in the Texas school board meetings, or the Texas Board of Education meetings, as well as, on Glenn Beck's television show with David Barton, they've created this kind of very detailed and internally coherent facsimile of the real world, which is actually a kind of characteristic of not just fundamentalist religious movements, but totalitarian political movements as well. I mean, that's something that Hannah Arendt described really well in The Origins of Totalitarianism. And, although I don't think that we're anywhere, I certainly don't think that a bunch of, a bunch of apocalyptic losers in Michigan is going to bring on the end of democratic governance. I think the movement or this kind of tendency is totalitarian in its intent, even though it'll never get there.
Yeah, but they strive for it, and at least they can make it totalitarian in the worlds that they inhabit, right? I'm saying that we can have our own television station, faux news, right? We can do all this stuff, and some of it. I mean, part of me is a cynic, and I'm like, you have the people really believe this stuff, or is it just a good way to make money? Mm-hmm. Because I keep thinking, Ann Coulter says all these things, or whoever it may be, the flavor of the day, Glenn Beck, whoever. They say all these wild things, and I'm like, God, you just count the dollars and you go home, right? And you do whatever you want, whatever it is that you do. But
although that's something that's pretty hard for me to get my head around. I kind of can see that could easily be true, but that actually it's hard for me. I mean, I think that most people fundamentally like to think of themselves as good people. I mean, I think even if they're doing kind of really wretched and terrible things.
Yeah, they may think of themselves as good people, but it wouldn't be. I mean, every day that Rush Limbaugh says something, I mean, he takes his money, he goes down to Dominican Republic. What's he doing down there? What's going on? I mean, he's having a good time with his money. This is Mr. Healthcare sucks, and he had a health scare, and he had to go to some hospital. Now, granted, he can pay whatever he needs to pay for hospital care, but if we had it the way he wanted to have it, he wouldn't have been able to go.
But it's hard for me to believe that it's just purely show business and that there isn't some that they haven't, that they don't truly believe that they are genuinely aggrieved, and that they haven't at least convinced themselves of their own point of view. I mean, I guess if it was just purely an act, if it was purely, some kind of great postmodern money-making hoax, that's kind of, I guess that's a level of cynicism that's kind of really difficult for me to understand. I'm really a fatalist, so you have to just tell me on this one. It's me, okay?
I just look at them and I think sometimes, Glenn Beck, damn it, he can cry on cue. And so, part of it is that I think for Glenn Beck, it's a real experience. I mean, for Rush Limbaugh, I mean, I think he just enjoys throwing a monkey wrench into everything and making a mess. You say yip, he's going to say yap. That's his business. I mean, I don't think Rupert Murdoch, cares one way or the other whether he gives out good news. I think he cares that station, Fox, makes
that's
great
true. I
entertainment.
think that's true. I think that's true of Rupert Murdoch, and it doesn't really surprise me so much when it's kind of a businessman running a business so much as somebody getting on television and radio every single day and saying shit that they know is not true, or that
But some of it is, all of this is a business. I mean, once you start to do these things, whether you could say this for the liberal side. I mean, you can once you get your niche. I mean, you can believe everything, but it is a business. Right. And I think that's what's so interesting about where we are right now, is that it doesn't take much to start this business, right? You could be on the web and you say some really great things on the blog, very right, very left. Being centrist doesn't get you anything anymore, right? Being a nice middle of the road person. So the discourse has changed, and as a result of that discourse changing, it changes the way we read religion. It changes everything. So even the ways in which you might fight for something that you used to, fight for, let's say civil rights or abortion or, pro-choice, pro-life, all these things are subject to how are you going to draw people into your side, and then begins this other kind of thing that, looks, for some people, not everybody, but for some people, I think looks like hucksterism.
Should we end it there?
Yeah, I think so. Because you know what? I mean, at the end of the day, everything we've talked about today is A, sort of depressing, but B, it what makes our jobs go well, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it kind of, there is kind, actually when I published a book about religious fundamentalism in American politics in 2006, and there was really, it was called Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism. Yeah. And there was really a brief moment when I hoped that book had become obsolete and kind of irrelevant. Yeah. And yet it seems to have, all those themes are actually coming back even worse than ever, and, with even kind of, more fevered intensity than they had during the Bush administration. Yeah.
No, and that's a really good point. And I think what we have to look forward to in the future is more of this stuff. I mean, and if I have to use a business analogy, that's good for you, right? You get another reprint if you update.
Well, I would have been. I actually would have been pretty
happy if it all been brought away, huh?
Into oblivion. Yeah. But anyway, it's been great talking to you.
Yeah, you too. And let's see what changes. Maybe we do this talk again in 3 months. I'm not sure if a lot has changed. I'm kind of thinking it might get worse, but I'll be an optimist for you.
Okay.
All right. Thanks.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.